Thank you so much, Kelly, for being here and coming to have coffee in my cafe with me. I appreciate it.
So good to see you again. Beautiful cafe.
Thank you. I wish it could be in person. I miss seeing people in 3D.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear about what you're researching right now. It's always of interest, but I think particularly in the last couple of months, it's taking on a little bit of a different tone and a different light.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. We've been studying at Accenture Research talent in general, future workforce trends for the last several years. But the one thing that we've done and started to do, luckily, before COVID-19 hit globally, was really double down on the people dimension of work. And everything that we research really comes down to this fundamental question, which is how do you unlock people's potential? And then enter in whatever the context might be, whether that's alongside digital transformation, alongside technology, maybe in a particular industry. And then it became during crises, during a global pandemic. For us in the States, it's also, unraveling the systematic racism that we find within our organizations. And so all of a sudden, the top of mind, what's for CEOs right now is my business continuity is now a people issue. And me making sure that I can lock my people's potential is going to make the most business sense. And I have to do that. That wasn't the question that we were hearing on top of CEOs' minds before the global pandemic hit. So the silver lining in all of this is twofold. One, from a research perspective, we've actually doubled our research budgets and are going after more people to understand how we do this during a crisis. The second thing is our questions remain the same. And now I think we're finding even better insights as we have economic downturn and all of the stressors that are happening in our environment today. How do we actually leave people net better off? And what does that look like?
What is net better off? And why are we leaving people that way?
Yes, exactly. So it's funny, it was a question that actually started almost 2 years ago. So before the crisis mode, let's say, and it was really it was a bunch of CHROs, Chief Human Resource Officers, got in a room and we're looking at employee engagement data and said, gosh, people seem pretty miserable at work. Our engagement scores aren't going in the right direction. Our business profits may be going, up, but our people dimensions don't seem to be accelerating at the same level. If anything, at the time, there was quite a bit of downward trend. And so it felt from an HR perspective that work was broken. I admire these CHROs, one of which is our CHRO at Accenture, who really wanted to use science to answer this question. So of course, we got into a room and whiteboarded all of the reasons, quite frankly, why work sucks, is one of the headlines. And so, during that time, though, we said, what does the data say? We really need to go out and ask workers. And so we looked a lot actually to our marketing colleagues and thought, what if organizations spend as much time understanding their people as they did their customers? Because we know our customers a lot. We know what motivates them. We even know their subconscious, what we can advertise to them. You being in behavioral change know this a lot better than I do. And so we thought, what is a way that we could create a metric? Because we know business leaders are driven by metrics and numbers and accountability that would actually elevate employee well-being in the workplace. And so we took a lot of learnings from the Net Promoter Score that's used in the marketing space with customers to really understand, again, how do customers promote the brand, promote engagement with the product or service they're offering. And we took the same theory and learnings and said, let's apply that to the workplace. And we asked, again, the simple question, which is how do you unlock people's potential? And what we decided to study was the actual motivations, the very fundamentals that organizations have to get right if they're going to actually unlock their people's potentials, their skills, their strengths each day when they come into the workplace. And what we did is we did this really great analysis to determine what is that alignment, or as you know, we're going to talk about today, that sweet spot between the fundamentals of people and the fundamentals of business. And so, we came up with a 6-model framework that we really believe encompasses more than just the transactional dimensions of work, paycheck, employability, but a lot of what's in your space, mental and emotional health, relational health, physical health. And what we find is, especially during times of pandemic, those are the dimensions that spike. And those are the dimensions that often are overlooked. Executives are missing the boat and aren't seeing that these dimensions that drive people aren't actually the paycheck at the end of the day.
And I think what's so interesting, having a lot of conversations about the future of work, and two, with senior leaders, which, to be frank, a lot of them are at mid or late career because they work their way up. And so what they were rewarded for, what may motivate them might be really different, and certainly looking at like mental well-being, it wasn't a conversation when they like, so it's not something they grew up in, if that makes sense. So are you having these conversations with senior leaders that are eye-opening for them, or maybe they didn't think about work in the same way?
So right off the bat, these 6 dimensions of net better off, what we found were universal. So they were across all the generations in our study and across the globe. Only 9% of one's net better off score was actually attributed to individual difference, things that we can't change, such as gender, age, etc. But when we do ask generations who's responsible for leaving their people net better off,
Yeah.
not whether or not you have these needs, but actually who's responsible, what we found overwhelmingly is non-executives, younger generations are looking exclusively to their employers.
Right.
You know, with the Edelman Trust Index, they actually trust their employers more than governments, as an example. And so we saw 78% of workers say, yeah, it's my employer. I'm looking for them to provide me purpose right now. I'm looking for them to help me with loneliness, my relational health. I'm making sure that work doesn't give me stress and gives me a heart attack on Monday morning, you know, which we know through some of the health stats here in the States anyways, tends to be the case. And so that's what workers are looking for. But then when we did go ask executives who many times do, you know, from a generational perspective, have more experience and tend to be older, before the pandemic, we found a startling stat. It was 1 in 3 executives felt responsible to leave their people net better off. During the pandemic, we saw that jump to 1 in 2, so about 50%, but there's still a dramatic gap between leaders and companies who are trying to meet employees' needs and what they're focused on versus what the general population is looking for and almost demanding now from their employer.
So if we think of leadership, if we think of the C-suite, and then even in the managerial roles, what should they be working on? So you talk about leaving people net better off, but it's not exactly skills that have been built into their leadership training or management training. So if you could design a program for leaders to leave their teams net better off, what would it look like? What would it encompass? What are those skills we should be developing for this future of work?
And you're absolutely right. Most of the executives that I meet with, you know, I become very empathetic because, you know, they were trained in managerial science, which many of them say, I'm going to be honest with you, I've never taken a psychology class, you know, human motivations. Nope. We didn't talk about that. I learned how to balance a budget sheet and how to take costs out of the business and drive efficiencies. But when it comes to actually leaving people net better off, that was not necessarily part of the MBA curriculum at the time. So one, hopeful that universities over time will start to double down on the social science behind work, because that is a lot of what drives our behavior. But an interesting finding is when I tested what actually accelerates human performance at work. Because at the end of the day, I think we're all driven to want to do better, to bring our best selves to work. Which of the dimensions need to be fulfilled? And it's interesting, in terms of the actual statistics, it was the emotional, mental, and relational dimensions that actually accelerated our performance in the workplace. Now, those who might be listening who are IO psychologists who have a background will say, well, yeah, we knew that 30 years ago. But this is truly new to management science and the business discipline. To answer your question is, you know, what are those leadership behaviors that are going to accelerate that emotional, mental, and relational components of people's well-being at work? Because that's not top of mind. 2 things you have to get right as a leader. Right off the bat, what we're finding, especially during the pandemic right now, is you have to be compassionate. You have to lead with compassion and empathy. You can't check that at the door. And the one thing,
do you mind if I ask about that? Is it compassion or is it empathy?
Right, because they're 2 different things. And,
they're very 2 different things.
and you know, us on the applied side like to, you know, jazz it up with some marketing headlines and call it all both. So the true research actually found compassion.
Okay.
So it was actually compassion. But then we end up actually doing a lot of empathy training to try to make compassionate leaders, but we can talk about how effective that is. But it is compassion. And it's, you know, ensuring that as leaders, we're creating the space and capacity to have tough conversations to allow for a humanness in the workplace. And so, as I'm sure you know, when COVID first hit, we were having a lot of issues with all the background noise and children and dogs and everything else happening. And we had some leaders who just didn't have time for it, who still were trying to drive business results, you know, moving 24/7. And that's just not going to accelerate those dimensions of being left net better off that way. But the second thing is, not only did we find workers saying, I need compassionate leadership, I need a leader who is going to make room for my humanness during this time, I also need a confident leader. We found high levels of anxiety and stress this losing sense of agency or being in control of creating positive outcomes, we saw really spike when COVID-19 first hit. And so I'm not just looking for a leader who's going to be compassionate and give me the space to bring my humanness to work. I'm then also looking for a leader who's confident and who has a self-efficacy to help me navigate this ambiguous environment and is still willing to create time for learning and still willing to take risk so that we can come out and survive and eventually thrive through these crises.
I think you nailed it, because I've had so many really great vulnerable conversations over COVID with leaders that are like, I'm leading through, I have no idea, right? So knowing that there's a level of fear, uncertainty, rapid change within life and then within work, and they're leading through things they've never had to lead through before. So trying to appear confident and then not necessarily feeling that way, and then holding space and holding compassion and holding space for people's mental health, but then not having anybody check on them. So I know this is a little outside of your scope of research, but has there been conversations about that and how to take care of leaders during this time as well? Because I think we're asking a lot of people right now to get into realms that they may not have ever experienced before, and certainly more so than we would ever expect of them before.
Yeah, we know through Albert Bandura, the theory of self-efficacy, which gives us agency or control, that we actually think we can create a positive outcome in our environment. Here's the problem. A lot of that depends on one, social learning, and two, past experience.
Yeah.
Neither of which that most leaders have for this environment. We haven't had a global pandemic in 100 years. So there is no playbook right now for CEOs or executives or leaders, managerial leaders even, to pull off the shelf to understand, okay, here's how I deal with the global pandemic. Here's how I deal with systematic racism in our organizational systems. And then here's how I deal with an economic crisis as global GDP continues to decline, upwards close to -5% this year. How do I lead people in the midst of all of this? And oh, by the way, you have to do this all through technology. You're not going to be able to do this in person. And so what we're doing right now, we're actually initiating a brand new research study that's going to kick off next week to actually answer this question of how leaders are coping right now. How are they actually still showing up with compassion and confidence? What are their behaviors? What are their mindsets? What are their practices that they're doing day in and day out to actually do this? And what's the new playbook they're creating? And that's, as an optimistic researcher and social scientist, what I hope comes out of this is we have a new playbook for how we run organizations and how we do business. And I believe, with a lot of these conversations, people and their net better offness, their well-being will be front and center, because if anything, what this pandemic has highlighted is without the well-being of your people, you don't have a strong business model and you have a lot of risk and no business continuity.
Yeah, and majority of your work is with knowledge workers, and of course, their knowledge is the work. So to be able to perform well, they need these aspects. They need to be able to bring this to work. And how do you do that? And how do you appropriately do that when work is at home through a global pandemic, and you're worried about your own finances, your own fundamental needs on top of all the additional things. So it's certainly really interesting. What I'm loving from all these conversations, it just tells me that the work I'm doing is right. So I'm really excited that you're just confirming that people's mental well-being and well-being at work is so important. So we talked about the leadership and their leadership role, but what about the company or the system, and how can they support Net Better Off, and what can they do for their people right now and then ongoing, of course?
So what we ended up doing as a research team is we wanted to get down to the actual practices that companies at the company level that they could adopt that would actually leave their people better off and their organization better off. Because at the end of the day, we mostly deal with for-profit businesses. And so we tested 20 different talent practices, things that companies do all the time to try to engage their employees or make their employees better off. And what we found is only 5 actually worked to leave their people net better off and increase organizational performance. And so this is really key, because right now, as we're in the midst of a crisis, one of the things that leaders are struggling with is help me make the trade-off decisions. I don't have an endless budget anymore. I have less, not more, going into this fiscal year. What do I need to double down on to make sure I meet people's needs when they're at an all-time high? And so it's, from a economics perspective, it comes down to trade-offs. And what we believe through our research is if you can focus on these areas, and I'll go through them in a second, you're gonna win this game, and eventually survive the crisis. So the very first thing we found is how companies are using technology. Are they doing it in a way that's enabling autonomy in their workforce and flexibility, and also elevating people in their work? And this could be knowledge workers. This could also be frontline workers or retail workers, hospitality, fast food workers. But it's the way that technology is being leveraged, which is true of the practices, make a tremendous amount of difference in people's well-being. As I know you've studied a lot too, technology is often used in the workplace not to accelerate productivity and employee well-being, but it's actually diminishing returns. We're constantly on, we're constantly pinged, we're constantly distracted, making a lot of cognitive switching back and forth between tasks. And so again, the way that companies approach technology and do so in a way that actually makes people better and allows them to do more focused creative work are companies that are winning this. The other thing that they're doing though is they're becoming extremely transparent in the way they treat their people and their people metrics. So they're reporting out on either their shareholder reports on their website, people metrics that might be vulnerable to, some of their competitors and give them, maybe four was seen as competitive advantage. These leading companies are actually holding themselves accountable into a higher standard to say, I will share with you our gender numbers. I will share with you our, race numbers. I'll share with you our pay equity numbers. So you can see the gap between our CEO and the lowest paid employees. These leading companies have nothing to hide. And then the last thing they're doing is they're not making employee well-being a check the box exercise where we go on and you have to do your mandatory training hours. They're actually co-creating with employees. So they're doing a lot more listening, understanding the contextual needs that emerge throughout the workforce. As an example, I work with a financial institution. They still have banks that are open. So there's that whole workforce that's still going in every day and servicing customers. Then they also have headquarters, and those employees have been remote. Two dramatically different needs right now, I'm net better off. The retail workers, primary physical, how do I make sure you're gonna keep me safe? The headquarter workers are all about the emotional and relational dimensions right now. And so again, having programs that aren't a one size fits all, but actually contextualizing it for your workforce is also what leading organizations are doing. And that's what we call the sweet spot, because it doesn't just favor the employee or favor the business, it actually does both. From an employee perspective, absolutely your responsibility is to show up each day ready to bring your potential. That's what you have the agency and control of, is you bring the skills and strengths. And you also have the responsibility to develop those skills and strengths to make sure that you're marketable and making sure that you're keeping up with the demands. However, it is the organizational's responsibility to provide the environment to cultivate that potential. You might be a person with really high potential, but if you're working in organization A that isn't focused on employees' well-being, that isn't focused on leaving you net better off, it's going to be a mismatch. On the flip side, you might be working for organization B who's cultivating all the right things, but if you're not bringing yourself to work and actually developing and utilizing those skills and that potential, that's a mismatch. The best is when it's a true match between the organization cultivating the environment and you as an individual taking the responsibility to bring who you are and to continue to develop those skills, is what we find in the research.
So what I tell people when it comes to, for example, mental well-being, there's three things that are involved. There's the individual and what they're learning and training and practicing. And then there's the direct manager. We learn how to work and we learn how to not work from our direct manager. And then there's this system in place that needs to cultivate and to add on to that. So I think there's multiple layers there. And I've worked with many companies that are like, we can train our employees and then they'll go off and do it and they'll take care of themselves and it's their responsibility for self-care. It is, but it's also yours to allow them to and to provide a supportive environment. And so I think it's a really great way to share responsibility and to be able to leverage the things we know create greater likelihood of success.
I don't want to be overly optimistic here, but I do believe these conversations are here to stay. And there's a couple signals that cause me to think that. One, right off the board, right before the global pandemic hit, there's this thing called the business roundtables, and 181 CEOs signed a declaration in 2019, shifting a notion away from shareholder primacy as a primary purpose of business onto stakeholders. And they actually elevated the responsibility of organizations to meet employees' well-being and needs. So that was already a conversation shift that was slowly happening. And what I found COVID-19 has done in particular has accelerated that and really shown a spotlight on organizations who were missing the mark on that and kind of left behind versus those that were prepared and ready to handle the influx of workers. During COVID-19, we found 50% of workers were contemplating a career change and thinking about leaving their company. And so the economy will eventually rebound. We will resume normal activities, whatever that new normal looks like. And there will again be a war for talent. And companies who get this right and lead with compassion are going to have the high tech, high knowledge workers flocking to their organizations once talent has the choice again of where they work. So the thing that we say is people will remember how they were treated during this time. This will be a very memorable moment. And employees who get this right and continue to get this right long after the pandemic will have higher performance in the long run. And actually, the most compassionate thing you can do is be transparent and direct with people. In my previous HR roles, I have had to do massive workforce reductions and have had to look at 200 people in the face one day and let them know that their job was no longer available. It's the toughest thing you can do as a person and as a business leader and as a human. And there is no right way to do it. There's no wrong way to do it. But the thing is, you have to understand and really bring that compassion to that conversation and also that confidence. So from a workforce reduction perspective, those are just tough conversations, but you have to be transparent. And the worst thing you can do is blindside people. I manage a pretty large team here at Accenture, and we have to have a lot of tough conversations. And again, I call these tough moment conversations. So prepare the team, create the space. During 10 minutes of our team meeting today, I'm going to be providing feedback that's going to be tough. And then having an open dialogue on what are the barriers and enablers of how we got to this place, making sure the employee feels heard, but then also making sure that there's a path forward. And at the end of the day, I operate a team through principles. So having principles makes some of these conversations easier. Start with values, don't blindside people, make sure you're preparing them for these tough conversations and giving them space, and then making sure you're listening.
We talked about this a couple times today. I think it is transparency is absolutely key, and honesty. Everybody's in a difficult position, and I think that people realize that there's metrics to hit at the end of the day, and not to be so simplistic. The business has to make money, and they have to hit targets. Like that's why a business exists. So these conversations need to happen. We all, at the end of the day, want to get better, and we serve this purpose. How do we do that, and how do we do it together? What can we improve? What are opportunities that we can leverage?
A lot of companies right now are going to no meetings on Friday. Has it been executed perfectly? I try to do that with my team. We are trying no video calls on Fridays. Also, some people are using out of offices creatively. So putting an out of office of, hey, I'm taking a 4-hour focus break, or I'm not going to be checking emails. This is my time to actually go work or go with my family, whatever the case may be. So I think what's interesting is it's almost like there's this newfound communication that's necessary as a transparency barrier to let people know I can't be available 24/7. I am one person. So when you keep saying this function or this, team, at the end of the day, this is coming through me. There's one person. I can only handle so much input in one day. And if I'm servicing India and Australia in the morning and then trying to keep up with the West Coast, there's no time to sleep or have any sort of personal life. So you have to put those communication barriers up and be transparent about it and be very proactive.
It's something that I've been studying a lot of, and then having the more informal conversations. We are in a communication era. We are in a tech era. You design your day or somebody else does. So I highly recommend that you design your day. Barriers and boundaries, often people are like, oh, this is bad for my career. It is not. People actually respect you more if you have set and strong barriers. What I challenge leaders on the call and in the audience to do is know how much influence you have. So yes, you might have time to do emails at 7 o'clock after you put your kids to bed, but you're then putting that stress on somebody else. Know as a leader, you shouldn't be putting it on somebody else's plate. So with my team, that is the communication. It's not perfect. I try to send everything I work on in the weekends and evenings. So I also have the open conversation on how we work, and that they have permission not to respond, and really being able to grant that. What if it's urgent? Pick up the phone, use a different messaging system, something else that highlights that is of urgent communication. I know it's simple, but it'll go so far to protecting your stress level and the stress levels of those that you communicate often with.
If you leave your employees not better off, if you meet them where they are and take care of these 6 fundamental needs, you will perform better. We also have another piece called human resiliency. The one thing when we talk about compassion is when we asked, what's the most compassionate thing you want from your leader right now, was give me permission to work differently. And so you might need to go ask for permission to work differently to your leader. And so I think a lot of times what I ask employees to do is those one-on-ones, take those times, don't just focus on the operational processes task list. Ask for time to actually have a conversation around how work is working for you and things that you need in order to unlock your potential. And you frame it in such a way of, I want to bring my skills and strengths every day. I want to come and give my best. Here's a few things though I'm asking for. Can I have permission to work differently in these ways? It's having that dialogue. Most of the times, leaders are very open. If I have someone coming to me telling me they want to give their best, they're going to make my job easier by giving their best. Those are great and welcome conversations. So again, as an employee, approach those with a lot of compassion too, but ask for permission to work differently and make sure you're taking advantage of those one-on-ones and times with your leader in ways that together, you might be able to improve.
I love that. Like, I want to be and work my best, which is obviously what your leader wants as well. So you're
Yes.
kind of coming together and not being like, I'm different, whatever. I want to bring my best. And one of the biggest stresses for people, why they don't take effective breaks, why they don't take weekends, is they feel like they don't have permission to. So as a leader, it's such a small thing that can go so far. There's small things we can do, but I think as a team member coming to your leader, remember, they want the best out of your potential, or at least they should. So being able to have that open, frank conversation. So all of this is about connection, communication, and really leveraging the human side of work.